Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Wortley. I'm the Virtual Conferences Director at IORMA. And before we actually get underway, I'd just like to say a few words about IORMA and what its remit is and objectives. The IORMA Consumer Commerce Centre is a neutral resource for business and governments that recognise the need to understand and respond to the ways in which the 7.6 billion consumers are changing. They're changing in the products and services that they want and need and the ways they want to obtain them. And these changes are happening globally, driven by developments in society, in business and in technology. Now, today we'll be talking about universal basic income. Before we start, I would just ask you, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to type in any questions, and just reserve the chat for any comments that you may have. Now, at the start of this webinar, before I introduce our moderator for this session, I would just like to try a poll with you, and I'm going to ask our audience and also our panelists a view on universal basic income. So the question is universal basic income a good idea? Yes or no? I'll just give people a few seconds to provide the answers to that before I share the results with everyone. Okay, so I'm going to end the polling now, and I'm going to share the result. So we can see 78% have those responded say that universal income is a good idea, and 22% no. Oh, thank you very much for your responses. I'll now hand over to your moderator for this session, Paul MacDonald. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon and welcome to the Future of Work and Universal Basic Income. I'm Paul MacDonald. I'm the Executive Director of Global Digital Foundation, and I'm moderating today's one-hour discussion. The Foundation is a think tank that takes a special interest in the impact of public policy on the development and use of digital technology. And so on behalf of my colleagues, I'm very grateful to the people at IORMA, particularly Jane and David, for the opportunity to have this conversation with three of the country's most important thought leaders in the area of economics, work, and technology. This IORMA webinar is one in a series of discussions held every other Thursday, and I urge you to visit iorma.com to check out future conversations and indeed to view past conversations. Our subject today is the future of work and a universal basic income, and to discuss this topic, I'm joined by David Smith, who is the Chief Executive of Global Futures and Foresight. David's previous roles include Strategic Marketing Director for the Global Financial Services arm of Unisys, where he co-created that organization's Global Futures Forum. So that makes David a futurist, which means I understand, David, that your job is to think about how and why our society and economy are changing and to help us to succeed despite all of the disruption. I have that right, I think. Next, we have Graham Leach. He is the Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the economic consulting firm Macroeconomics. He's a former Chief Economist and Director of Policy at the Institute of Directors, a visiting professor and senior fellow at the Legatum Institute, and a member of the Shadow Monetary Policy Committee at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And finally, we're joined by Martin Tiplady, Managing Director of Chameleon People Solutions. Martin has a background as an HR director in both the public and private sectors. Until recently, he was a member of the UK Police National Pay and Conditions Board, and in 2010, he was awarded an OBE for services to human resources and policing. Gentlemen, thank you for taking the time. And welcome to all of you who have joined us for this discussion. If you have questions of your own, then I encourage you to put these into the chat, or into the Q&A rather, as the conversation progresses, and we will endeavor to get to anything important that we haven't covered. So first of all, I want to begin by setting the scene for our audience and our panel. And to do this, I want each of our panel to answer the same question. COVID-19, or perhaps more accurately, policymakers' response to COVID-19, appears to have accelerated changes or trends that were already visible at the level of the household, the firm, and within the wider economy. And I'd like each of you to tell us, what are these trends from your perspective, and where are they taking us? And I'll give you each 2 minutes to summarize your thoughts. David Smith, starting with you, you're on record as saying that pre-COVID there was a narrow view that technology was the greatest vector of change, when it was always and remains the customer, in fact, who is the main vector or the main driver. Can you answer my question generally, but also explain what you mean by this as you answer it, and please help us set the scene.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Paul. The technology has been at the heart of change in our economy and the way we operate and act for 50, 60 years. And in truth, it goes back to Queen Elizabeth I with the first stocking making machine in 1590. I mean, she didn't give a patent because she didn't want people to be thrown out of work. So there's nothing new whatsoever about a new technology. The interesting thing about technology is it's new. The next one is we don't know the impact, we don't know the consequences quite of what it will do. Therefore, we're fearful of change and we're fearful of it. Now, you asked about COVID-19. The pandemic has accelerated quite dramatically, as you said, the uptake of online, of remote, of technologies to enable that. And people have found they like it. And that's what I really enjoy about technology, is that actually, if you ask someone to change, we're normally quite fretful about it. We don't like it. Once we experience it, we're unbelievably good at adopting it. So we need to understand that psychology, that the way that humans, people, consumers, citizens act is actually incredibly dynamic, but don't ask them in advance to change. But you'll see in every single walk of life, whether it's accountancy or airlines or construction, there's a new technology that's impacting the very nature of work, the very essence of what we do. And increasingly, it's not just automation that we're seeing happen quicker and faster and easier. It's online everywhere, so the dynamic is global, not national. And finally, if you like, we're leaving the digital age as an old-fashioned term. It served its purpose to get people into using, if you like, smaller, more nimble devices, and that was great across companies, online, interactive. All of that's fantastic. But we're now taking that as table stakes. Everything to do with now and the future is automated and intelligent. So this is the really exciting thing to do with work. It's the first time professionals' roles are being automated. We've seen manual and clerical people in the past. Now it's professionals who have had to study longer to reach their level of competence. So sometimes it can be longer to re-educate, retrain, reskill, readapt. And just to sum up, the second part of the conversation is about universal basic income. And I see its role very much in acting as a stopgap and the lag between the speed at which we can take up new methods of doing things, new business models, new education models, etc. The speed at which we can take up those new ways of working, which may leave people high and dry for a while working. Universal basic income can take up that lag until we re-educate, and then we carry on as normal.
Yeah, okay. I want to get to UBI a bit later, and so we'll focus on that a bit later. Graham, can you give your view on this? Just where are we at? What are the converging trends that you experience, and where is it leaving us? And do you agree with what you've heard?
Sure. Oh, I always agree with David. No, seriously, historians love chapter breaks, and I think we're definitely going to see COVID-19 as a chapter break in history. It's one of those things which has put history on fast forward. David's alluded already to the changing learning, retailing, working models in society, and how they've put that and the changes therein on fast forward. But I would probably add that I think the two biggest changes in the wake of COVID, and ones we're going to touch on today, is its potential for accelerating technological change, and it's also a capacity for accelerating big government as well. We're seeing it already in accelerating geopolitical change with the rise of nationalism and arguments about deglobalization. So COVID is having an immense impact at at the big picture level, at the big macro forces in society.
Are you alarmed at the growth of government itself?
Yes, yeah. I've got to say, I think I'm at odds with 78% of the people on the webinar, because I was quite horrified that 78% said it's a good idea, because I understand why people say that. They're in the wake of the furloughing, that people feel more comfortable, the government providing a safety net. But let's not forget that furloughing will come to an end. Indeed, the Treasury is already very, very, very intent on trying to do what they call let the labour market clear, so they can find out which are the real jobs and which aren't the real jobs at the end of this. It's a very sad process. But the very fact that you have to bring the furlough to an end because it's unaffordable tells you something very powerfully about UBI as well. But I don't think you want me to talk about UBI now. You want to come back to that later. But that is linked to big government, that people in the wake of COVID-19 will have seen government wading in as the solution. And we're going to forget, unless we reverse this process, that the government, certainly with regard to technology, is part of the problem. The countries which are going to seize the moment, seize the day, who are going to advance most over the coming decade, are those who are going to be able to take on board the technological revolution, which is now underway. And big government is the last thing you need in those circumstances. You need a dynamic, flexible, market-led system with higher productivity growth.
Okay. Martin, I'm interested in your perspective on this, because in a way there's been a kind of a merging between the home and the workplace, in that people are now working from home. And I'm interested just to get your perspective about these broader trends, but what they mean for the individual and his or her relationship with their employer and their skills and their futures and so on. What kind of workers are we going to be in this world?
Well, let me just say at the outset, futurists have for many, many decades assertively predicted the rise of technology and the robots in which intelligent machines take away jobs. But I have to say that, frankly, that era never really happened, or at least not in the way envisaged. And undoubted machines made advances into the workforce, but there really has not been a wholesale transfer from human to machine. And then, of course, the pandemic. None of us foresaw anything like it, and what is to follow over the ensuing 5 months, the impact on our lives, on our work, on our jobs, on our cities, on our loved ones, on the NHS. No one anticipated in February what would happen just 1 month later. And we've got through that period with skill, with commitment, with adaptability, with changed working patterns, with lots of biting of tongues, with a level of tolerance and a lot of human inspired activity, and a lot of technology too. But the important bit in running technology to survive through this period has been the human input to making it work. None of us simply turned on the system and it happened. We thought our way into coping with it. And the system was designed and tailored and piloted and developed by humans. And so the pandemic will set the scene for longer term change. As companies reconfigure workforces and their factories and their plants, those with the necessary financial backing will, with long planned investment into new machinery and more automated ways of working, secure their places in the market. That's a good thing. Companies will see opportunities to put money into new data systems to connect the supply chain. So why would any of us desist those advancements for the future, other than out of fright about what it does to our labour market?
But you have to admit that what COVID has done and the response has done is it's certainly accelerated massively. I mean, we've seen in the space of months what would have taken years.
Massively, 1.8 million added to the unemployment list. But I would like to think that where we are at is not about replacing them, but it is about reskilling people in order to cope with an entirely different work plan from what they do at the moment. The need to work the machines, the need to interpret the data that comes from them, the need to prepare us for this next layer of technological advance. And that will be where the issue of universal basic income will come later on, in terms of helping us through that interregnum whilst that period happens over a really long period.
Okay, thank you very much. I now want to just focus on the challenge from the point of view of public policy. And I want to focus particularly on UK productivity. I want to come to Graham first on this. It seems that most of us in the UK have been induced into approaching work as an extension of our lifestyle, perhaps, or we've melded the two. But the uncomfortable fact is that UK productivity growth has historically been poor, even before COVID. And of course, during the last quarter, it fell by 2.5%. Now, if you strip out financial services from the UK economy, things can look a bit frightening. But regardless, we're going to have to do our jobs better, and many of us will need to get jobs where we are more, where we're more productive. How is this going to happen, Graham? How are we going to get over this?
Well, I think the key thing here is actually the future is not, the past is no guide to the future. If we look back over the last decade in the wake of the financial crisis, you're absolutely right. I mean, productivity has been very weak. The term secular stagnation entered the lexicon. So there's no debate about the weakness of productivity growth. What it's done in recent quarters, that's just a purely cyclical effect, so you ignore that. But there's been an underlying long-term weakness. But actually, I'm writing a book at the moment which argues that we are standing at the cusp of an upward inflection in technology-led productivity growth because of the convergence of 5G, AI, Internet of Things. All these technologies are producing new, different, agile, more dynamic business models. And they are changing society, and they will change society. But it takes time. The first iPhone didn't reach mass market attainment until what, 2010, 2011 maybe. It only came out 2009, if I remember correctly. And it takes a while for companies to learn how to use these and change systems. And what's happened with COVID is that, I would argue, is that it's just accelerated that process. They've done a lot of learning, which would have occurred anyway, but they've done it more quickly.
But I mean, it has been remarked that with all the investment in technology in the last 30 or 40 years, I mean, I don't know who it was who said, you might remember who it was. Solo, I think it was, the economist. And he said that technology is showing up everywhere except in the data.
Yeah, it was. Robert Solow, yeah.
Productivity statistics. So you think that's going to end soon? You think we are going to see real productivity gains now?
Yes, I do. I mean, not in the short term, because there's a downward cyclical effect, and we've got to sort out the labour market and what are real jobs and what aren't. But there is an underlying structural change here, which is the nature of technology and how it impacts society. And that's where I think, and the key point is just to back up what David said really as well, is that there is massive technological change underway here. And Martin pointed out as well that, there'd been sort of false dawns before. What I think, and I believe very strongly, and I argue in my book, is that there's not a false dawn. This is real. What is going to occur over the next 10, 20 years is going to be truly massive in terms of the technological revolution and how it will change society and business. But at the same time, all that automation and all the stuff that's going to happen doesn't mean we should just harken back to old Luddite fallacies about all the jobs will disappear. The lesson of history is unequivocal there, in my view, and I don't think history's changed.
Okay, thank you for that. Martin, a lot of companies, I think even with full reversal of measures to prevent the spread of COVID-19, are going to be left, and are probably already left, looking like dinosaurs in terms of their structure. And how do you think better training, more qualifications, better approaches to HR will translate into more productive enterprises at the level of the firm, and not just the firm, but perhaps the household also? Because again, I think there is this merging between people in their home, working from home, which will be a longer term thing. How is this going to work out, you think, for people in terms of our skills and training?
I think we need to look back over this period and take learning from it. In many ways, one can regard it as a trial period under which we've unexpectedly completely reconfigured the labour market and how it works. And there's some damaging effects of that, but there's also some advantages to it. But we've got to take the learning from it. And I'm involved in one or two businesses at the moment who are taking a very different approach to their future structure. It's not that they're saying that we will completely close down our central operations and decentralize them and the like. It is just they're looking at what has worked during this period and what hasn't worked, and what do we need to do to our systems to make them work even better. Look, as I think back over the last 5 months, overnight, employees had to find sticky plasts to put over a whole range of systems to make them work with immediate effect. That's fine, but they won't be sustaining over a long period of time. There's a different type of permanent system change that's required and structure change to make them work over a long period. And so therefore, the whole issue about reskilling mindsets, reskilling skills around how we work more remotely. It may not be as remote as we are at the moment, but it's certainly not going to be as it was in February. It's somewhere in between, where businesses will be closing down a lot of central operations. They will be allowing rather more flexibility about working conditions and from home, and they will need to really toughen up on their management and their governance and their systems in order to get through this next period.
There's a whole psychology piece, isn't there? About
it is.
Worker psychology.
Yep. And the people I speak to, it is not about, and there are the physical things that matter, but the issues that employers are going to have to deal with is how do I supervise properly people who are remote, who I never see, who I never speak to? How are we going to run our promotion systems because I never see the people? How do I actually make sure that they're performing? I am aware of one employer who is ringing his employees every single day, and every loo break, every lunch break is having to be logged in and logged out. That is an unsustainable position for the future. But there's something around which employees have got to really think into this new way of working. Technology is a major player in that. It doesn't do away with the jobs. It means that it sustains a different type of working model for the future.
Thank you very much. David, I want to put you on the spot here. Your job has been to analyze social and economic change and to help companies and individuals to chart their way through. And I want to put it to you that up until now, you've probably had it relatively easy in that things weren't moving that quickly, but now you've got your work cut out. So let me put it to you bluntly. The UK has left the EU. We've just gone through COVID, still in it really. And the UK's productivity growth from this standing start is not much to write home about. Now, if the UK in 10 years' time is going to look back on a glorious decade of economic growth and success, what are the great ideas we need to embrace now in order to get there?
Well, that's a bit of a big question, but I'll give it a go at answering. Let me just say, first of all, and it's an interesting point, I'm not a futurist who talks about technology replacing human beings and throwing them onto the waste heap. That's not what I'm about. I've been involved in technology since '73 and watched it through those eras. But what I would say is that we have massively changed job roles in those 50, 60 years. You know, if you think about mainframes in the 50s, they replaced serried ranks of clerics writing in manual books and changed the very nature of the speed at which we can do banking and accounting and everything else. So, you know, the bottom line is that technology has made lots of people roles, tasks redundant. And we've equally found speed and new tasks and new roles and new satisfactions for people to be employed against. So it's good news. The bad news is if you try and hold on to the old ways using new technology, the road to damnation, if I may put it that way, is thinking that all we've got to do is use a new technology to do an old thing. Actually, first we use a new technology to do old things, then we do completely different things. And that's the bit that we've got to watch we don't get caught out by. Before, we've always had time for a sort of two-stage commit. We've learned the role of a technology. Think about Graham's comment about the iPhone. It was 2007, actually. But it took a number of years before people realized, actually, I could go out and communicate with people while I'm out. I could find out why I came out shopping because the traffic's so bad I started before I even knew why I came. So we changed our behavior because of a technology. And what I'm trying to say earlier on, in a rather sort of hurried way, I suppose, was that first we do things differently. Then we do different things. So our role in society, in business, in government, in policy, is to help organizations think about what else might they do? What would they do differently? You can't do the old thing just in a faster way anymore, because the new guys are coming up in the block, whether it's in the UK or not. Those services are in the cloud, they're remote, they're fast cycle, they're attractive to people who find them. So the nature of that is exciting. To me, I was on a jobs panel at the Royal Society some while ago, and I talked about abroad. We have got such skills in the UK that we can transmit remotely from here to abroad and make this country a vast amount of new money. We don't have to worry about taxing people more as the only source of new revenue. We can grow the cake, we can grow the income, and therefore fund ourselves through this change. And the bottom line is, it's the change that matters. Look at the speed at which we take up new roles. And by the way, we contributed to 130 new job tasks, which people might want to now start taking notice of, but they're already coming to pass because COVID did, as you said, it accelerated the rate at which we found these technologies. And the point I made earlier is we found we quite like them. I think there was a guy recently said, I've tried to get people to come back to work, but they wouldn't come. So we've got used to, and this is COVID lockdown. This isn't remote work as we know and love. That will be more sophisticated, as Martin quite rightly said. We'll blend human interaction with remote working and we'll make lifestyles. But last comment on this, I suppose, if you like, is, you know, of all the time we've been making a living for ourselves, let's say in this country, to keep it simple, we've done it on a craft basis. Only the last 200 years have we had to be co-located in the industrial era of working. People try to keep that going with everybody in the office 9 to 5 and managers needing to see what they were doing, blah, blah, blah. We're now going back to a more blended craft environment. And that is fantastic for society. It's fantastic for communities. It just means there's a lot of new skills. And by the way, I tried it, I'm useless at it. But new skills to have a light touch with people, to stay in touch and keep things moving. And last comment, really, if you can't trust people to work properly, I guess you ought to fire them.
Okay, that's great. I want to now move on to the next question, which is to do with, and it's really drilling a bit further into this use of technology in the workforce. And I know that I want to open it to whichever of you feels they wish to really take this on. And it's really, you know, talking about the what are you seeing at the moment in the economy, and how fast will it be in terms of the take up of AI, and in terms of the impact on jobs? I mean, it's really adding some nuance to the answers that we've had. Does anybody want to have a go at that question? Graham, perhaps? No, not you. Yes,
that sounded more compulsory than voluntary, but I was going to wade in anyway. So that's. Yeah, I mean, I think the initial short-term response to that is it all depends on the epidemiology. So the epidemiology and second or third waves or not is going to drive the economic cycle in the short term, and that is going to dominate, and it's going to. That's going to be the crucial factor in actually mitigating a lot against long-term strategy. But long-term strategy will emerge. So what am I saying? I'm saying the closer you are to a V-shaped recovery and the further away you are from an L-shaped recovery, then the more likely and the quicker these underlying structural changes will begin to occur. The deeper the economic hole we get into, the less cash which is going to be floating around, and the more uncertainty and the more precautionary behavior you're going to have from companies towards business investment. So there's a short-term answer to that, and then there's a dynamic long-term answer. But I think what we have seen, and we've talked about it already, is the emergence of these new kind of, as Martin kind of sticky plaster business models, which are temporary solutions. And people are seeing that suddenly they're actually managing to cope with a very different system to before. And it's opening their minds up to different and new ways of working. And there are going to be companies out there, many, many thousands of companies, where when furlough ends, the jobs are not, or all the jobs are not going to be there. And I think my biggest concern here is that whilst I'm very optimistic about the longer term impact of technology, I am concerned still about the labour market consequences of that, because there will be a mismatch. Those new jobs will be created in Seattle and Silicon Valley, but the jobs lost in Wisconsin and Missouri or wherever they might be elsewhere, there is a huge issue there. So there is a labour market cost here. it's overall net positive, but it begins to shift wealth around and it begins to shift income around in a way that one has to face up to what will be a very significant challenge.
I mean, it seems to be something that we've already really started seeing, which is the sort of disparities of wealth we're seeing, certainly in Western countries now, which may well be underlining some of the civil unrest in Europe and the United States in particular. David, do you have anything further to add on this point? I know you discussed it briefly earlier.
I won't say too much more, but look, actually it was 2010 when there was the first divergence between national revenue generation and employment income. So in terms of the relationship between those two things, it's been quite consistent for quite a long time in the US. In 2010, we started using automation to generate wealth faster than incomes were increasing, i.e. we weren't employing people at the same rate to do the work. We were generating more with machines. So that's the excitement we can do with machines. They do have to be, we have to know how to exploit them. We have to know how to educate people to use them. We have to maintain them. There's a whole new 3 massive job areas there. Thinking of new areas again, the real issue is, can we exploit new technologies? As Graham said, the chapter is the interesting issue. There is a bit of a break between the old world and the new world, and it's very clear. And it needs a leadership that's prepared to say, what I do now is redundant. I may have a run out period. I may have a number of years in which I can exploit it, but I need to get on top of the new world. You know, am I selling cars, or am I using automated cars in the future? Am I increasingly going to provide services for these automated world, or am I going to wither on the vine and continue to try against the tide to do what people don't want to do? So the trick is to think, okay, what are my core skills as an organization? What do we fundamentally do well? How can I readapt that for a world that could be impacted by different technologies, consumer behavior, business, organization? And one small example, for example, is fintechs in banking. They've been banging away at the door for years, and people have been, broadly speaking, happy to run with inertia, staying with the big 4 banks in the UK because it's safe and it's easy, blah, blah, blah. But actually, we've seen that during the lockdown and the use of remote banking services, a lot of these fintechs are actually far better. They literally provide better services. My wife yesterday, while we were sitting in bed, photographed a check, and it was immediately updated to her bank account with a new bank. You know, and I had a check from, I didn't have a check actually, but if I had one from my business folk, I'd have to go and drive it to a bank, put it in and wait 5 days. And that's a startup, believe it or not, the wrong one. So, you know, technology is very attractive if it's implemented well. The good news is, a few years ago, if you tried to invest in a motor car manufacturer, your chance of picking the right one was about 1%. And we're in the same game. You know, we can see the trends in terms of what's going to make a difference, but it's hard to see the name of the one that's going to succeed ultimately. So being flexible of mind, being aware that things are changing, being prepared to drop your management structures, your organizational structures, your employment norms, is the game in town, and that allows you to be flexible and successful.
Yes, yeah, I think so. I mean, certainly, it seems that also from and I'm kind of interested in this from the point of view of the individual worker, and you know the skills that individual workers will need to have to be competitive and to be employed, and of course the possibility that if you can be remote in a suburb of London, then you can be in Delhi or anywhere else for that matter, because it doesn't make a huge amount of difference to some of the jobs that are being done now and the skills that are being brought to bear. So it's definitely a challenge. This leads us on to.
Sorry, Paul. Can I just add one thing in there?
Yes, indeed.
I mean, the added dynamic there in what you just said is that there's not only a potential surplus arising in parts of the labour market, although I'm arguing overall that it would be net positive still. But in addition to that, the labour market competition is suddenly in many, many, many areas global in the wake of COVID-19.
Exactly.
There is an awareness. Yeah. And the big question then is, going back to David's point about GDP and actually employee income growth and earnings growth, then what does that imply for future earnings growth if you're competing with somebody who's only on 20% of your salary?
Actually, just a very brief question there. Sorry, go ahead.
Paul, can I just add a point, which is, I do think
Martin,
we are coming into a stating of the bleeding obvious, really. We're into a crisis period, and to manage a crisis, the big strategic response to it is not going to be forthcoming in anything like and immediate future. So I think we're into at least a 10-year lull, whilst I think Graham described it as the V-shaped recovery. I think we are going to go into a V-shape in terms of where we're going and how long it would take to come out of it. And importance whilst we are going through a crisis is that we have initiatives and solutions that try and fix the issue in the best way possible at the time. But there's also a longer term fix that is being constructed, which will take effect from whatever period of time it can take effect from. And it's holding the nerve for long enough, both in terms of government and employer, and dare I say even employees, because we are going to go into a high unemployment number. We are going to have unemployed at a high level for a very long time, and those individuals are going to be harmed. They're going to be damaged.
Okay, thanks for that. We need to get to the next question, which is the final question, which is universal basic income. And UBI, as it's called, I think it would have been considered unacceptable absolutely just a few months ago. And I guess following on the furlough, people perhaps maybe expect UBI to come onto the scene and to be on the government's agenda. I'm interested in this, and I have to start. I guess I have to start again, David, with you about UBI. Is it realistic? What are the problems with it? Does it cause incentive issues? Are there hybrids that we could think of in terms of, well, I don't know if it's UBI, but Denmark's flex security, for example? What's your take on UBI?
It's twofold. It is possible if you ran it for a very, very, very long time, you'd change the culture that would become anti-innovative. I mean, I worked for the Brunei government a while ago, and they've been paying for their population in everything for decades, and they were trying to get folk to become entrepreneurial, and it was stunningly difficult. The language wasn't even there, but we're not there. We're in a place where I genuinely feel that actually there is room for UBI for a period as we flex from a world where machines and capital is generating revenue to a world where people can reabsorb themselves into a new economy. So I think there is a lag because of the rate of change. New materials, new forms of transport, ending old ways of doing things. You know, it's $1 trillion of business transport disappearing in a year, every year, because of this pandemic. I mean, people just aren't going to go back to the old way to the same extent. So old ways of doing things are dying. Those people are going to find it difficult to find worthwhile jobs. New ways are emerging fast. I think Amazon announced 10,000 more people today. They've got 40,000 people in the UK. Those aren't necessarily all warehouse jobs. Some of them are engineers and management and leadership type roles. So new ways will emerge. But UBI, I think, has a role. We've seen it in Finland. I mean, last year there were 150 experiments around the world looking at UBI. So there's lots of fact finding going on about what does it do. But one thing it does, if I finish off this last comment, is, you know, in terms of cognitive ability, mental wellness, innovation, some of the evidence is coming out that it actually does generate that. It increases those issues amongst our citizenship. So there may be room for it.
Graham, I can't imagine you're sitting around the IEA salivating over the idea of UBI, are you?
No, I don't. I'm not aware of it doing so. I would just go back to my previous comment. Really, the reason you have to bring furlough to an end is because of the sheer cost of it to the system, and the disincentive effects that if you're then raising tax rates, which have negative supply side effects that reduce the incentive to work, save and invest, then you've got a big problem. So furloughing illustrates one of the key points around UBI, which is that in the long term, we just can't afford it. Now, the interesting thing, David mentioned all the tests and pilot projects and all sorts of things around the world. I mean, one of the key characteristics of the whole UBI debate is that those who are most optimistic in a technological sense, the Elon Musk's, the Bill Gates of this world, who are talking about the sheer scale and gargantuan nature of change, they can't get their heads around there being anything other than a very negative employment consequence. So they're uber optimistic on the technology and uber pessimistic on the employment consequences, and that leads you to UBI, because then you're in a world of highly paid people at Google and everybody else on the minimum wage or not in employment at all. And that's how the UBI debate has developed. but it's starting from a flawed assumption. That flawed assumption is that you will need it in the first place. Now, there may be temporary and transitional issues, and there are things that there is already a benefit system to cope with that, and there needs to be retraining and reskilling. And so all those arguments, like I accede to and accept. But the key thing here is that I don't think you necessarily do need a UBI model. I think it's been used as a means of subterfuge almost for those who want to increase the size of the state. And it's a good way of getting the state in there. But the problem with this is it will have exactly the wrong consequence than you want. If you want to destroy future accelerations in productivity growth due to technology, then start taxing the hilt out of the rest of the population to fund UBI. So if you want to crash the economy, that is the way to do it.
It seems that your view is that really the productivity issue for Britain is a kind of a brick wall, you know, that you can't get past in terms of things like UBI, because if people aren't producing enough, you know, who's going to pay for it? Well,
it's not a UK thing. That is just that would be the case anywhere. It is a huge. It's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge. But actually, the solution is precisely the opposite of the UBI. The UBI theme is basically saying we need more government. I'm saying we need precisely the opposite of that. And that is the danger of COVID-19, that it will cushion people and immune them and desensitize them as to the economic costs of big government. Okay. Martin, what's your take on UBI?
Well, I agree with one thing Graham said, and I disagree with one thing he said. I agree with the fact that furlough has to an end, not just about affordability, but also about the symbolic nature of what it means and what the scheme generates. So furlough has to an end. In order to then get through this long lull period that we're about to go into, we need a cushion. And in that respect, what cushions exist at the moment in the form of universal credit and the like, they're just simply the wrong solution for the wrong issue. It's too clunky, it's too means generated, it is too bureaucratic, it is too selective. And so therefore in that setting, UBI, or whatever it might be called, actually has to become a realistic proposition in order to survive what I think will be a generation in order to get the world through this situation. It is something, after all, that people can get and feel safe with. Where I disagree with Graham is that he says it's a temporary thing. Well, it's going to be a very long temporary period, is what I say, in order to sustain it. And so therefore, I don't regard, you know, a 5-10 year period as temporary. It's a pretty permanent fix until the world has recovered with a much more technological and much more reorganized state from where we are at the moment. So I'm a supporter of UBI with limitations.
There were some questions coming in, and I think the first one, I had a question actually from a colleague of mine, which he emailed me, so it isn't in this chat. We'll just work through some of the other ones in the chat now. And his question was, he said, ask your panel what the impact of UBI would be on the market for financial credit, the credit market, consumer credit market. Does anybody have an opinion on that?
I mean,
who's going to lend you money? If you're on UBI, who's going to lend you money, and what will they lend it for? It seems a bit of a tricky one.
Well, yeah, but I don't think it's a particularly new issue. That is just an issue that is there, that if you're on low incomes or benefits, then you are going to struggle in that. Sadly, that's just the reality of the way the world is.
Right. Just another, I'm just looking here at some of the questions, and somebody is asking, Juliana is asking, are we likely to see, are we likely to see an expansion of the gig and platform economy? So there are people, I suppose, out there who are younger people who are probably worried about, you know, are we now heading into a kind of dystopia? I'm not sure if that's the import of the question, but I'm going to add that spin to it, if you forgive me. You know, are we going to move into a dystopia where platform and gig economy is what most people end up actually doing?
Can I have a go at that?
Yeah, please.
At the moment, the gig economy,
David, yeah,
and that's synonymous with low price 0 hours contracts. The way the world's likely to work in the knowledge economy, at least, is that most people will work in the gig economy. As I mentioned earlier on, we're moving more towards a craft industry where our skills are going to be required by organizations at different times. So maybe a job requires half a dozen skills, of which some of those are aging, some of those are worthwhile, whereas companies need to require skills. So increasingly, we'll see organizations using more contractors, more non-employee staff to get tasks done where skills are short and scarce in particular, or they need the volume for those particular new functions that aren't currently in the existing workforce. So I think we're going to see a much more granular employee workforce in the future. Not all self-employed, not all working from home, not all remote, and certainly not all in any sense to a gig economy. I think the independent world is going to be much greater. In fact, we added 1 million new SMEs in the last decade before the crash. So our natural comfort zone actually is to have more control over our lives, market our skills independently, and with the internet and everything else that goes around it, we can do it.
So do you think the environment, and this is not just to you, David, but to anybody else, do you think that the environment is going to be more conducive to starting your own business now, in the next two or 3 years than it has been, or are we being sort of weighed down upon by big government?
Can I come in there? I mean,
Please,
I think in
Graham,
the potential, and this is where I'm really optimistic, the potential for entrepreneurship, if we unleash the technological revolution and we don't hamper it, and the more we hamper it, the less the opportunity for entrepreneurship will be. But it's going to be primarily for those younger age groups. So everybody's really worrying about younger people now, and I understand why. But actually, they're standing on the threshold of something absolutely enormous, where their skill sets, what they take as natural and instinctive, which for oldies like me isn't so instinctive, is something which is a huge opportunity in the future. They already have skill sets. Even if they don't have specific skill sets, they already have general skill sets, which make them very suitable and adaptable for all sorts of roles in the future. So I'm a real optimist on that front.
Are you worried about?
Can I add to that, Paul?
Sorry,
because
please, Martin. Yes,
I think that's absolutely spot on. Yeah, I'm not worried about the youngsters. I mean, sorry, I am, but I'm not disproportionately, because they are going to enter this next period with some, if not all, of the right skill sets, and most importantly, the right attitude about what this change period is going to look like. Whereas the old fogies like me and what have you, and even a generation or two under me, are actually ill prepared for it. So it's not the young generation that worries me. It is going to be the 40, 50-year-olds in terms of what happens over the next 10 years.
But if we just go back to UBI for a second, I mean, if I go into my local pub and have a conversation about UBI with somebody, I mean, I've been trying to say Britain is broke. Britain can't afford UBI. It's got colossal debt. Debt's getting far greater. I mean, the fiscal position, I mean, I suppose it's a macroeconomic question, but I mean, is the fiscal position of the country getting to such a point now where policy choices will be constrained?
Yes, but the constraint is obviously this year with 325 billion plus deficits is an aberration, and we're not going to continue at that rate. A lot of that is just because of lockdown itself. So if you don't have a lockdown, the deficit will reduce from that. But it will still be way into six figures unless remedial action is taken, either on the spending front or on the taxation front. And the problem we have now is that fiscal policy was already set on what I would argue is an unsustainable path, i.e. because of the cost of an aging population, then for health, social care, all those issues around that was already going to add 5-6 percentage points of GDP to the cost of running the government. Now, what's happened is that we brought that and more much forward. We brought it forward, and we've still got that to come. So unless we reorientate now, then actually we've got another 5 or 6% of GDP on top over the coming decades, which if you look and you just work it through the numbers, then the impact that has on income tax, corporation tax, capital gains tax, in other words, on the incentives to work, save and invest, are colossal. Just to give you a rule of thumb, at 10 percentage points of GDP, i.e. going from, let's say, 40% of GDP pre-lockdown to 50% of GDP, that shaves anything up to 1 percentage point off GDP growth. Now, 1 percentage point, it may not sound much, but believe me, on a long-term basis, when you've only got 1.5% at the moment, that is a big, big change. It means you're in an Italian style scenario of nigh on zero growth.
There are a number of questions here, and they're along the same lines about the impact of creative destruction on the economy, I guess, Schumpeterian creative destruction on the economy. And I think there's a sort of anxiety in some of the questions about, will there be enough human jobs to replace the jobs that we lose? I guess that we've already heard from you, a number of you at least, about the fact that technology tends to create jobs as well. There's anxiety, I think, also in some of the questions about the sort of the need for people to be trained up in new skills, I think there's a question which has popped into my mind, which is that one thing we never discuss, or it's not often discussed when we talk about how to cope with a crisis like this and what we need to do to adapt, is the public sector. The public sector in Britain is, I'm guessing, around half the economy. Well, certainly it is now at the moment. And yet it seems to be relatively immune from those dramatic technological revolutionary changes that take place, except maybe at the front end. You can pay taxes online and stuff like that. Do you tend to agree with me? I'm a little bit skeptical about the public sector's ability to become more productive using things like technology and innovation.
I think the issue for me on that, Paul, is that
yes, Martin,
most of the heavy duty, significant public sector investment in technology has actually been fraught with failure and overrun and over budget and not a lot of benefit. Yeah. And so therefore there's hardly a good track record. And so therefore, having worked as HR director for the Met for 10 years, I can well see how it is difficult to argue for big number IT investment when the track record is anything but. And so therefore you look for small fixes that bolt on to what you've got. And then 5 years, 6 years later, you look at it and you think, how did I ever get to that system? We need 10 times more money now in order to change that system. So I think there's a confidence issue. We could go through them, couldn't we, in terms of child support agency, the benefits organisation, no end of NHS, no end of failures in IT investment. So there will need to be a complete recalibration of how some of that works from here on. I agree with you. There's just not a track record of delivery.
David, what's your take on this?
Sorry, just 1 second. Could you just come in just to reinforce what Martin said there? You're absolutely right. A litany of failure. When I was at the IOD, we had our head of digital who used to monitor public sector infrastructure in IT projects, and it really was a long list of failure. But there's also this huge opportunity, isn't it? Because in economics, there's something called Baumol's disease, and that's where you get. That's in where you've got very people-facing, people-dependent sectors. It's very difficult to get for more productivity growth out of them. But now, one of the key arguments now is that from now on, then technology will be able to affect those people-facing roles in a way it hasn't done before. So you've got the tradition of failure, so you've got that history set against this enormous opportunity.
I want to go to David now, but just before I want to just make a quick remark, which is that I think in many cases technology, what happens is it gets bolted on as a fix, and it never really changes the business unless the business has to change other aspects of how it works to fit the technology. So technology tends to require a revolution within the organization, apart from just buying the technology and sticking it in. David, what's your take on this question about the public sector and about how it can embrace the challenge?
You made the key point there, Paul. It's about the leadership. It's about the management of it. It's about the acquisition of the use of technology, and that's where we need to have a refreshed thinking. ministers make up policy that needs to be implemented very regularly for all the reasons we know, and IT is required to follow in some fashion. So you get the worst form of legacy platform that Martin was alluding to, that slows down innovation, as vast percentages of the budget are consumed simply by keeping the lights on, something held together by string and chewing gum. We've seen organizations try their best to flush these systems out, but they are monolithic and massive. The bottom line is that in our government, in the British government is actually at the foremost of using technology at the front end with its citizens. So, we are a shining example to other countries, which frightens the living daylights out of me. The bottom line is that, we need to separate the reality of implementing technology from the ability of people to fiddle with it. Because as an old technologist, I know that there is a vast cost to altering a system partway through implementation. A vast cost. Changing it at design stage is minimal cost. Changing it at implementation is disaster. We change our systems in implementation all the time.
In the public sector.
Therefore, we blame it as being a disaster, and very often actually is a disaster. We bite off too much rather than it being incremental, but that isn't the point. We expect too much of it, we fiddle around with it. So the issue is not the technology, and I don't believe it ever has been. It's actually how we use the technology and how we govern the technology and the people who run the technology. And that, to me, there needs to be a disconnect between altering those systems in a haphazard fashion. It may still need doing for policy reasons, and being able to clearly state the impact and therefore resource it properly, not just expected to be able to cope with it. You end up with a complete shambles otherwise.
Okay. I guess I'll ask just each of you maybe in sort of one or two lines and no more. How optimistic are you in general? I mean, I think I've heard some expressions. Generally speaking, you seem to be optimistic to me, but are you optimistic in an unqualified way? Are there things that the government needs to do or needs absolutely not to do in order for us to get past where we are now? So each of you, we start with David.
Okay, what am I going to say about this? Very quickly.
Just a couple of lines, a short statement.
With Brexit, with COVID, and the globalization of services that we can take on board, now is not the time to burden business and industry with tax. We've got to grow the size of the pie, grow the economy to fill the gap, not burden it with more taxes. That's not going to work.
Okay, Graham?
Technology is our great hope, but the great threat to technology is the size of the state in the long term. And the fact that we could, as David said, just burden people with higher taxes, which reduce the incentives to work, save and invest. And my fear is that the politicians have got no appetite to really sell a hard message here, which is actually that you need to again revisit austerity and you need to revisit parts of the public sector. But most important of all, I would say that the key thing is completely counterintuitive. What we should be doing now is not raising taxes, but lowering them.
Okay.
Take the hit.
Thank you for that. Martin?
Hold nerve, I think, is my summary. And also think dual track. We need low-hanging fruit in order to get through this period. But whilst we are getting through this period and showing all of the furlough scheme was a masterful piece of immediate change that was brought in. Whatever prompted that is the thinking that's now needed for this next period, whilst there is a much bigger piece being developed about how we come out of this at the other end. So
okay,
two tracks.
Thank you very much. Well, that's all we have time for. I'd like to thank the three of you for your time. David Smith of Global Futures and Foresight, Graham Leach of Macroeconomics Consulting, Martin Tiplady of Chameleon People Solutions. Thank you very much. And we'd like to thank you, our audience, for giving us your very valuable time and for your questions. You should be in receipt of a questionnaire about this event, which takes just a minute to complete. And I'd like to remind you that the next webinar in this series will take place on Thursday, the 17th of September at 2 p.m., where the topic will be online versus face-to-face learning. Many thanks.